It was generally agreed in Flaxborough that the annual Women's Institute Produce Fair represented, if not the moral centre of the town, then at least its digestive conscience. Behind the starched tablecloths and geranium arrangements, reputations had been made, tested, and occasionally unmade by a teaspoon, too many of lemon or a shade too little of virtue. On this particular Thursday, the hall smelled agreeably of sugar, floor polish, and polite jealousy. Rows of gleaming jars were arrayed like small trophies under the fluorescent lights. Each bore a handwritten label, Seville, fine cut, and the faint tremor of personal ambition. The judges, 3 in number, and collectively confident in their discernment, had just reached their verdict. Mrs. Constance Tyndall, wife of the clockmaker, had won first prize for her marmalade. The announcement met with the sort of applause that civility requires but sincerity cannot sustain. "Very fine," said Mrs. Dorcas Pell, with the air of one conferring a benediction on a lesser creature, "though to my mind a little sweetness conceals a multitude of sins." Her remark, dropped into the hum of conversation, landed precisely where intended, within earshot of Mrs. Tyndall. The latter, a pink and anxious woman, smiled as if gratitude might erase insult. She murmured something about having followed the same recipe as ever. "Ah," said Mrs. Pell, eyes narrowing with the contemplative pleasure of a cat over cream, "and yet sameness can be deceptive." That afternoon, Mrs. Tyndall returned home with her blue ribbon, and Mrs. Pell remained at the hall to assist in the clearing away. It was noted, by those inclined to notice such things, that she seemed in better humour than usual, humming a hymn as she wiped the tables, and that she took a particular care to pack her own preserves before the rest. By Saturday evening, the satisfaction of the fair had settled into the usual post-event calm. The vicar's sermon on Sunday was devoted somewhat mechanically to the virtues of humility in domestic achievement, and Mrs. Pell's sharp features were seen nodding throughout. Monday dawned still and grey, as if the weather, too, preferred not to intrude. It was the charwoman, Mrs. Wilmot, who discovered the body. She had come to scrub the conservatory floor and found her employer seated in a wicker chair, her spectacles half slipped down her nose, one hand resting on a plate beside a single slice of toast spread with marmalade. The appearance was that of a woman overtaken by reflection, which in a sense she had been. When Inspector Purbright was summoned from the station, he found the scene impressively tidy. He was a man who disliked haste in others, and disliked it most when it appeared in the guise of efficiency. The young constable who had arrived first, a certain eager Mr. Love, was describing the situation with unnecessary animation. "No sign of struggle, sir. Windows open, but I'd say that's for the plants. Looks like she, well, just stopped." Purbright inclined his head, his gaze wandering over the neat conservatory. The pots of aspidistra, the stack of gardening pamphlets, the checked cloth upon the tea table. "Stopped, you say?" "Yes, sir." "People seldom do, Mr. Love. They are more often stopped." The constable reddened. "Yes, sir." Purbright bent to the plate. The marmalade had dried in a thin orange glaze. On the tray beside it, the half-empty jar bore a small handwritten label, Batch A, February. He lifted it delicately, turning it toward the light. "Mrs. Pell was an industrious woman, I gather," he said. "Every morning she made her own breakfast, sir. Her niece says she wouldn't trust commercial brands." "Trust," murmured Purbright, "is a word with an aftertaste." The inquest would take weeks, but curiosity needed no official permission. Within a day, Flaxborough had rehearsed several explanations, none of which extended beyond the moral limitations of polite speculation. The prevailing theory, heart failure, induced perhaps by domestic vexation, was widely preferred. Still, some found the details difficult to ignore. Mrs. Pell, despite her air of virtue, had written a number of letters recently, most of them to the editor of the Flaxborough Gazette and Informer. None had been published, which did not prevent their contents being generally known. She had complained in one that culinary deceit had entered the Institute like mildew, and in another that a dishonest teaspoon measures more than sugar. Mrs. Tyndall, when spoken to by Sergeant Love, denied any understanding of such remarks. She was seen afterwards at the greengrocer's purchasing oranges with trembling hands. By Tuesday, Inspector Purbright had received a discreet note from the coroner. No evidence of poison, though a trace of bitterness remained of uncertain origin. He folded the letter neatly and placed it in the drawer marked Inconclusive Matters. Then he paid a visit to the Women's Institute Hall, now echoing and empty. The caretaker, a man of uncertain ownership of both accent and broom, greeted him with bureaucratic deference. "Nothing touched, sir. They said you might wish to see it, as it were." "As it was," corrected Purbright mildly. "But thank you. Have you observed any peculiarities since the fair?" "Only the usual, sir. Forgotten umbrellas, crumbs, that sort of thing." "Oh, and one of the ladies, Mrs. Pell, that's the one what's gone. She came back Friday night. Said she'd left a jar behind." "Did she find it?" "I couldn't rightly say, sir. She left carrying one anyhow." Purbright's glance travelled across the trestle tables, where faint rings of sugar still clung like the residue of ambition. He imagined Mrs. Pell, alone in the hall's dimness, retrieving a jar whose contents promised vindication. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, he called on Mrs.
Tyndall. The Tyndall residence, adjoining the clockmaker's shop, possessed the same neat but exhausted charm as its owners. The parlour ticked faintly, as if every timepiece in the district were conspiring to overhear. Mrs. Tyndall, pale and composed, invited the inspector to sit. "I understand," he began, "that you and the late Mrs. Pell were both prominent members of the Institute." "We attended the same meetings, Inspector. Prominence is a matter of temperament, I suppose." "Quite so." Purbright accepted the offered cup of tea, stirring it with deliberate quiet. "She was a woman of decided opinions," he continued. "And you?" "I prefer peace, if that's what you mean." "An admirable policy. One hopes it's more successful in households than in nations." Mrs. Tyndall managed a small smile. "I always thought her rather high-strung. Not unkind, you understand. Merely earnest." "Yes," said Purbright. "I have often observed that earnestness can be exhausting to bystanders." She set down her cup carefully. "Do you think something dreadful happened to her?" He glanced toward the mantel, where a photograph showed Mr. Tyndall, moustached and solemn, presenting his wife with her blue ribbon. "I think," said Purbright, "that something faintly irregular occurred, though whether dreadful depends upon one's standards." When he returned to the station, dusk had already drawn its curtain across the town. Sergeant Love awaited him with a small brown parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Came from Mrs. Pell's house, sir. In the kitchen cupboard, marked 'Do not use.'" Purbright untied the string. Inside lay a single jar of marmalade, its surface clouded slightly with time. He read the label aloud, "Batch B for comparison." "2 batches," he murmured, and the winning entry was from Mrs. Tyndall. Love frowned. "Do you think there's a connection, sir?" "In Flaxborough, Sergeant," said Purbright, replacing the lid with meticulous care. "Everything connects, though not always in ways polite to discuss." He placed the jar on his desk, where it caught the lamplight like trapped sunlight. For a moment, the room smelled faintly of oranges, sugar, and a bitterness too delicate to name. Purbright regarded it thoughtfully, then leaned back in his chair. "Make a note," he said, We shall have this examined quietly. And, Sergeant, please see that Mrs. Tyndall's blue ribbon remains in safe keeping. Fame, however small, has a tendency to curdle." Love nodded, uncertain whether to smile. The inspector closed his notebook and glanced once more at the jar. The faint residue of marmalade clung to its rim, amber against glass, a small, sweet relic of some unspoken contest. Somewhere, a clock struck 7. Purbright listened, his expression one of mild enquiry. "Curious?" he said softly. "How often success and bitterness share the same spoon." And with that quiet observation, the room fell still, save for the ticking of a dozen clocks measuring time with unhurried disapproval. Flaxborough, faced with the small discomfort of an unexpected death, responded with its characteristic preference for tidiness over truth. The passing of Mrs. Dorcas Pell, though mildly alarming at first, was swiftly repackaged by the town into something acceptable. A regrettable interruption to an otherwise satisfactory week. Her neighbours discussed it with a restraint befitting a wet bank holiday. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could not be smothered by propriety. By Monday afternoon, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Loxby, had organised a condolence tea in the church vestry. She considered such gatherings spiritual obligations, though the congregation quietly suspected she enjoyed the administrative portion more than the pastoral one. The vestry smelled faintly of hymn books and disinfectant. On the folding table, a modest number of sandwiches had been arranged with stiff reverence, as though a more generous spread might imply impropriety in the deceased. Inspector Purbright attended not from ceremony, but from habit. He found that grief expressed through cucumber sandwiches was often more revealing than grief expressed through tears, especially in Flaxborough. He took a polite seat in a folding chair and accepted a cup of tea poured with mechanical sympathy. Mrs. Tyndall arrived 10 minutes late, her husband in tow. Her ribbon from the produce fair was not in evidence. She had presumably decided its presence at a condolence tea might be judged in poor taste. She moved with the nervous delicacy of someone uncertain which topic was safe to mention. Purbright observed her in a manner that was neither pointed nor casual, but something precisely between the two. It was an art he had perfected in Flaxborough. "How very unfortunate," Mrs. Loxby said, handing her a plate. "I do hope you and Mrs. Pell were on good terms." "Oh, yes," Mrs. Tyndall murmured. "Well, yes, in the ordinary sense." This statement, Purbright reflected, contained all of the nutritional value of mashed turnip and just as much substance. Still, it was a form of answer. Sergeant Love, posted discreetly at the end of the table, leaned toward Purbright with the enthusiasm of a young hound who has scented relevance. "Her niece says Mrs. Pell wasn't one to keep grudges, sir." "That," Purbright replied softly, "is merely one way of saying she tended to scatter them freely." Love blinked, uncertain whether he was permitted to smile during a condolence tea. He settled instead for a thoughtful expression which sat on him as awkwardly as a too-tight collar. Nearby, the parish treasurer, Mr. Kettle, was confiding to a group of women that he had spoken to Mrs. Pell only a week before. "Remarkably spry for her age," he said, in the tone of a man who had personally supervised her fitness. "Still, the Lord calls whom he will." "Possibly," murmured Purbright, "though it is unusual for him to consult marmalade beforehand." No one heard him, which was just as well. The conversation continued in its sedate, circular fashion, though a certain constraint settled upon the room whenever Mrs. Tyndall approached. People greeted her kindly. Flaxborough prided itself on kindness, but each inquiry carried the faintest pause, as though testing whether she might confess something inadvertently. It was not that Mrs. Tyndall was suspected of anything. Flaxborough simply believed that prize winners, like the newly widowed, might say something inconvenient if left too long without conversational supervision. "Inspector," Mrs. Loxby said, lowering herself into the chair beside him with the decisive rustle of starched cotton. "I hope you are not inconvenienced by all this terrible business." "Not at all," Purbright replied. "One grows accustomed, in my line of work, to domestic incidents." "Oh, but this is hardly domestic," she said brightly. "I mean, toast is hardly a domestic matter, is it?" Purbright regarded her. "Mrs. Pell died in her own conservatory with her own toast. One could scarcely conceive of anything more domestic." Mrs. Loxby's smile faltered. "Well, of course, when you say it like that." He sipped his tea. It was neither hot nor particularly pleasant. "Has the Institute expressed concern about her passing?" "Oh, yes," she said. "Such a shock for the committee. She had been preparing a special announcement for the next meeting. One hopes it was not important." Purbright looked mildly interested. "An announcement?" "So I was told. Something about standards. But then she often had views about standards, didn't she?" It was true. Standards had been Mrs. Pell's preferred subject, exceeding even her fondness for citrus preserves. She used the word with a kind of moral solemnity, as though it could be applied to any situation: public manners, private behaviour, marmalade consistency. "Did she seem troubled last week?" Purbright asked. Mrs. Loxby hesitated. "Not troubled. More purposeful." "Purpose," Purbright murmured, "is often the more dangerous state." By late afternoon, the condolence tea had concluded. The guests dispersed with ritual politeness, promising mutual prayers and exchanging remarks that gave the impression of sympathy without the inconvenience of sentiment. Purbright took a slow walk back to the station, accompanied by Sergeant Love. "I don't understand why everyone looks so uneasy," Love said. "If it was natural causes, then surely—" "Flaxborough," Purbright replied, "is not troubled by the death itself. It is troubled by the possibility that someone may be blamed for handling it poorly. Reputation, Sergeant, is our local currency. The town is careful with its small change." Love nodded, though he looked doubtful. "Well, I suppose Mrs. Pell did have a way of making people feel guilty even when they weren't. An endearing trait in moderation." "And when not in moderation, sir?" "Socially corrosive." They walked another few paces. The cobblestones still held the dampness of the previous night's mist. Curtains twitched discreetly as the inspector passed. People in Flaxborough liked to see what the police were doing, so long as they did not have to be seen doing it. Love cleared his throat. "Sir, do you think there was something wrong with the marmalade?" Purbright's tone became contemplative. "That remains to be seen." "But the jar you found, the one marked Batch A, it looked perfectly normal." "Yes," Purbright said. "But normality, like decorum, is sometimes a disguise." Back at the station, Purbright retired briefly to his small office. He sorted through the modest piles of papers that had accumulated in his absence, reports of stray dogs, a complaint about loud hymn practice, and an unsigned letter concerning questionable judging practices at the produce fair. That last one he set aside for later review. A light tap announced the return of Sergeant Love, who carried a notebook and a hopeful expression. "Sir, I spoke to the editor at the Gazette. He says Mrs. Pell submitted 3 letters last month, none of which were printed." "Did he say why?" "He said they were potentially defamatory." Purbright looked mildly amused. Mrs. Pell was frequently defamed by her own phrasing. Love hesitated. He also said, she asked, whether the fair could have an independent reviewer. She thought there might be, his words, ingredients of concern. "A charming euphemism," Purbright said. "Ingredients of concern. Did he keep the letters?" "Yes, sir. He said you could view them tomorrow." "Good. And the niece?" "Grieving, sir, very politely." "Quite." Love shifted his weight. "Sir, what exactly are we looking for?" Purbright leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "We are not looking for anything specific yet. We are observing. In Flaxborough, people reveal themselves not by what they say, but by the subjects they avoid." Love nodded as though repeating the sentence silently might help. "Avoided subjects," he said. "Right." Purbright gave him a faintly tolerant smile. "For instance, notice how Mrs. Tyndall avoided discussing her interactions with Mrs. Pell, or how the Institute ladies avoided mentioning next month's committee meeting." Why wouldn't they mention it? Because someone will have to replace Mrs. Pell as secretary, and positions in Flaxborough are seldom gained without murmurs. Love looked thoughtful. "So we watch what isn't said." Exactly. Evening had settled by the time Purbright left the station. He took a detour past the Women's Institute Hall. The windows were dark, and the faint smell of polish lingered beneath the drizzle. On the notice board outside, a new sheet had been pinned. "Meeting postponed. Further details to follow." Purbright studied it. The postponement was unsurprising. Flaxborough disliked making decisions while under the pressure of public sympathy. He glanced through the glass door into the dim hall. Something caught his eye, a small smear of orange on the inside handle. It was barely visible, little more than a thin crescent of dried preserve. He considered it a moment. Marmalade, like moral certainty, had a habit of appearing where one least wished it. He tapped the glass thoughtfully, then stepped back into the evening mist. "Well," he said quietly to no one at all, "that is interesting." With that modest observation, more a curiosity than a revelation, Chapter 2 came to its gentle close, leaving behind a lingering hint of citrus and a question still ripening in the shadows of Flaxborough. If there was one thing the Flaxborough Women's Institute disliked more than scandal, it was appearing to enjoy it. Hence, when the committee met 3 days after Mrs. Pell's death, the atmosphere was outwardly sombre, inwardly electric. The late secretary's empty chair had been placed at the far end of the table, as though to prevent posthumous interference. No one spoke of moving it, though its presence caused small, involuntary glances from time to time, as if the chair might offer an opinion on the proceedings. The meeting was held, as always, in the municipal reading room, a space distinguished by its lack of comfort and its air of moral supervision. A framed portrait of the Queen glowered benevolently from the wall, flanked by notices about the dangers of mildew in preserves. Mrs. Tyndall sat near the window, her gloved hands resting precisely upon her lap. She had not yet removed her hat. Across from her, Miss Teetle, pale, fretful, and given to trembling, fidgeted with a teaspoon she had brought, apparently for self-defence against silence. At the head of the table presided Mrs. Loxby, the vicar's wife, whose ability to appear both compassionate and in charge was admired, if not entirely loved. "Ladies," she began, adjusting her spectacles, "we are gathered in difficult circumstances, though of course it is our duty to continue Mrs. Pell's good work." A subdued murmur of agreement followed, polite as distant applause. "I think," Mrs. Loxby continued, "we might begin with a minute of silence in her memory. One must remember, after all, that Dorcas was a woman of principle." The minute was observed, or at least approximated. Miss Teetle dropped her teaspoon halfway through. Mrs. Tyndall's lips moved faintly as though she were calculating something rather than praying. When it was over, Mrs. Loxby folded her hands. "Now, the matter before us is who will take on the duties of secretary. I imagine none of us feels inclined to rush such a decision." No one disagreed. Indeed, the ladies of Flaxborough seldom disagreed with anything that sounded cautious. Miss Tyndall spoke first. "It seems premature, doesn't it, to discuss replacements? There should be a period of mourning. Miss Teetle nodded too quickly. Yes, yes, of course. Mourning is very respectable. Mrs. Loxby gave her a smile of controlled patience. Respectable, yes, but the Institute cannot remain paralyzed by grief. There are minutes to be written, correspondence to answer, competitions to arrange. These things do not cease merely because Dorcas, well, because she has ceased. The others looked faintly scandalized by the word, but could not dispute its accuracy. "I'd like to nominate Miss Teetle," Mrs. Loxby said. "She has the advantage of having assisted with the accounts last year." Miss Teetle made a small noise that might have been gratitude or panic. "Oh, I couldn't possibly. Dorcas always said I hadn't the firmness." "Dorcas said many things," murmured Mrs. Tyndall. This was received in silence. Mrs. Loxby cleared her throat. "Perhaps firmness is overrated. A gentle touch may be just what we need." Miss Teetle began to stammer an objection when the door opened. Inspector Purbright entered, apologetic yet immovable. His expression suggested he regretted the intrusion, but not enough to avoid making it. "Good morning, ladies. Please continue. I'll just observe from the corner. The superintendent felt it appropriate that I attend, for record purposes." The superintendent, of course, had felt no such thing, but Purbright had long found that attribution to higher authority saved everyone unnecessary explanation. Mrs. Loxby inclined her head. "Of course, Inspector, we are merely addressing the vacancy left by our dear friend." "Quite so," said Purbright, taking a seat with the diffidence of a man who suspected he had wandered into a beehive. "Mrs. Pell was a model of efficiency," Mrs. Loxby said, turning to him with pious solemnity. "We are lost without her." "I'm sure you are," he replied mildly. "She kept very thorough records, I gather." "Oh, indeed," said Mrs. Tyndall. "Lists of everything. You could hardly sneeze without her noting it in a ledger." Purbright allowed a pause. "Then you'll have no trouble identifying her successor." Miss Teetle made a small hiccup of laughter, quickly suppressed. "She was very particular," she said, "even about, recipes." "Especially recipes," added Mrs. Tyndall, and something faintly sour entered her voice. "Ah," said Purbright, "and recipes, I understand, were central to recent debates." "Debates?" Mrs. Loxby looked alarmed. "Oh, no, Inspector. The Institute does not debate. We discuss." Purbright inclined his head, conceding the distinction. "As you wish." The silence that followed was one of collective discretion. It was broken only when Miss Teetle, unable to bear the weight of unsaid things, spoke. "Dorcas did seem upset lately. She said some people were playing loose with the rules." "Rules?" said Mrs. Tyndall. "Recipe rules," Miss Teetle blurted. "Measurements, ingredients. She thought the judges ought to know." Mrs. Tyndall's gloved hand tightened around her purse. Surely she wasn't suggesting I had done anything improper? "My dear," said Mrs. Loxby quickly, "no one is suggesting anything of the sort. Dorcas was simply conscientious to a fault." "Yes," Purbright murmured. "Faults of conscience are quite fashionable in Flaxborough." Mrs. Tyndall glanced at him sharply. "Do you imply something, Inspector?" "I rarely imply," said Purbright. "I observe." And he did observe. How Mrs. Tyndall's eyes darted toward Miss Teetle. How Miss Teetle's hands trembled even more. How Mrs. Loxby's calmness was a little too practiced. He smiled faintly. "You mentioned Mrs. Pell's records. I should like to see them at some point." "Oh, the ledgers are at her niece's house," said Mrs. Loxby, "but I believe the recipe book remained here. She always brought it to meetings." Miss Teetle brightened. "It's in the cupboard, I think." She rose and went to the tall cabinet at the back of the room, fumbling with the latch. Inside, amid a confusion of pamphlets, lay a large cloth-bound book labelled Institute Entries, Preserves and Jellies. She placed it carefully before the inspector. Purbright turned the pages with slow curiosity. The entries were neat, dated and accompanied by remarks written in Mrs. Pell's exact, uncompromising hand. "Tyndall, flavour excellent, colour suspect," he read aloud. "Suspect?" Mrs. Tyndall's lips parted. That woman had no palate. He turned another page. "Teetle, pleasant texture, lacking confidence." Miss Teetle looked as though she might faint. She meant the jam, surely. "I would assume so," said Purbright, closing the book gently. "Still, one never knows with adjectives." Mrs. Loxby, perhaps sensing that further inspection might lead somewhere uncomfortable, rose briskly. "Thank you, Inspector. I'm sure you have more important matters than our humble recipes." "I find domestic detail surprisingly instructive," he said. "In Flaxborough, one's ingredients often tell the whole story." He rose, replaced the ledger, and made a small bow. "I shan't detain you longer." As he turned to go, Mrs. Tyndall spoke again. Her tone had lost its earlier composure. "Inspector, Mrs. Pell's death. It was natural, wasn't it?" He paused at the door. "The coroner will decide. I'm only concerned with whether it was tidy." "Tidy?" "Yes. Untidy deaths attract curiosity, and Flaxborough doesn't approve of curiosity." He left them to their discomfort. After the inspector's departure, the room seemed smaller, the air stickier. Mrs. Loxby resumed her chair. "Well," she said briskly, "that concludes the meeting. Miss
Teetle, I trust you'll act as secretary pro tem." Miss Teetle hesitated, then nodded weakly. "Of course, if that's appropriate." "It is always appropriate," said Mrs. Loxby, "to be of service." Mrs. Tyndall gathered her things with careful slowness. "Some people mistake service for obedience," she said softly. "Dorcas did," Miss Teetle whispered, though no one asked what she meant. They left the hall together, but not companionably. Later that afternoon, Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love stood in the Institute's back corridor, where Purbright had lingered after the meeting. "Did you notice, Love," he said, "how no one asked to see Mrs. Pell's notes before she died?" "Didn't want to pry, I expect," said Love. "Flaxborough doesn't pry," Purbright replied. "It peeks, politely." He ran his hand along the edge of the cupboard where the ledger had been kept. A faint powder of sugar dusted his fingertips. On the lower shelf, behind the pamphlets, was an empty spot shaped like a missing jar. "Curious," he said softly. "Sir?" Purbright wiped the sugar on his handkerchief. "Mrs. Pell's recipe book is thorough, but incomplete. I'd say one entry, perhaps one jar, has been removed." Love blinked. Why would anyone take that? "In Flaxborough, Sergeant," Purbright said, gazing out the window toward the grey roofs beyond. "People don't steal for value, they steal for appearances." He closed the cupboard door with deliberate quiet. The faint smell of citrus lingered in the air, a sweetness already turning bitter. And in that faint aroma lay the first real clue that Mrs. Pell's death, so carefully mourned, was not yet done unsettling the manners of Flaxborough. It was generally accepted in Flaxborough that the dead should be tidied up with no more delay than decency required. Mrs. Pell, though lately the subject of subdued fascination, was no exception. Her niece, Miss Cora Daintree, had already begun to sort through her late aunt's effects by the following Thursday morning, assisted, more by circumstance than choice, by the Reverend Loxby's wife, whose belief in moral order extended to the folding of undergarments. Inspector Purbright arrived at 10:30, apologizing with his usual civility for intruding on such an intimate occupation. Mrs. Loxby received him with a look that suggested she had anticipated his visit and would treat it as a kind of moral hygiene. Cora Daintree, a thin woman of 30, with an expression of perpetual surprise, sat among boxes of books and papers,
her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I suppose you've come for the ledgers?" she said, as if confessing to something. "I thought I might have a look, yes," said Purbright, setting down his hat and notebook. "We don't like to hurry these things, but neither do we wish to let them congeal." Mrs. Loxby gave a delicate cough, not entirely disapproving. "Cora has been most diligent," she said. "Everything's been kept just as Dorcas left it. Well, almost. Almost. There were some domestic adjustments. A number of jars, you see, had spoiled." Purbright looked at her mildly. "Spoiled?" "Yes. The cupboard under the stair was full of them. A dreadful smell. We thought it best to dispose of them before the niece's nerves gave way." "Ah, and you disposed of them how?" "The refuse collector came Tuesday." Purbright nodded slowly. "I see. A pity, though. Spoiled things are often instructive." Mrs. Loxby's mouth formed a polite oval. "Surely not in this case, Inspector. Dorcas was very particular." "I'm sure she was." He turned to Cora. "If you don't mind, Miss Daintree, I'll have a look through her papers. The recipe book, for instance." Cora pointed to a small pile of notebooks on the table. "There's more than one," she said. Aunt Dorcas kept separate books for jam, relish, and cordial. Purbright examined the topmost. It was bound in dark green oilcloth and labelled "Relishes, Private." The handwriting was careful, each entry underlined as if awaiting inspection. "Did she always label her private thoughts as such?" he asked. "She liked order," Cora replied simply. "An admirable flaw." He leafed through a few pages. One note, written in a firmer hand, caught his eye. "Mrs. Tyndall claims her onions are from her own garden. Not likely. Soil too poor for anything but fibs." Purbright smiled faintly. "She kept moral as well as culinary notes." "Everyone knew Aunt Dorcas had opinions," said Cora, "but she never said them directly." "Then Flaxborough will miss her conversation." Mrs. Loxby frowned. "It's unkind to joke about the dead, Inspector." "It's safer than joking about the living," he said, pleasantly, turning another page. By midday, the examination had produced nothing more incriminating than an unpaid subscription to Woman's Companion and a postcard from a cousin in Hull. Purbright stood, brushed imaginary dust from his sleeve, and looked toward the writing desk in the corner. "May I?" "Of course," said Cora. The desk was small, Victorian, and armed with pigeonholes. In the upper right compartment lay an envelope marked "To be opened only if necessary." The handwriting was unmistakably Mrs. Pell's, tight, angular, uncompromising. "Necessary," murmured Purbright, a word of immense elasticity. He lifted the flap, but did not open it. "Would you happen to know what she meant by this?" Cora shook her head. She was always preparing for necessity, extra sugar, spare light bulbs, that sort of thing. Practical to the last. He placed the envelope on the table and withdrew another item from the desk, a small key wrapped in tissue paper. "This, however, looks less domestic. Any idea what it opens?" Cora hesitated. "There's a locked drawer in the larder cupboard." "Aunt Dorcas said it was for vinegar." An interesting choice of security. The larder smelled of cold stone and faded spice. Mrs. Loxby followed at a dignified distance, like a moral chaperone for the curious. Purbright knelt, fitted the key, and turned it with the kind of patience born of long experience in unremarkable revelations. The drawer opened on a modest collection of notebooks and, curiously, a small brown bottle half filled with cloudy liquid. Its label, handwritten in the same precise script, read simply, "Orange, do not use." Purbright lifted it carefully. "A culinary warning, perhaps?" Mrs. Loxby peered at it. "I shouldn't think it meant anything sinister. Dorcas was rather melodramatic about spoilage."
If she thought a batch imperfect, she labelled it like poison. Prudent, certainly, said Purbright. Still, one wonders what made this particular orange so dangerous. He held it to the light. No smell. Cora, pale now, clasped her hands. Inspector, you don't think— I think nothing, said Purbright, until someone obliges me. He replaced the bottle and turned back to Mrs. Loxby. You mentioned the refuse collector. Might I have his name? I believe it's Mr. Tolby. A quiet man, very reliable. Yes, said Purbright. Quiet men often are. At 1:30, after tea of restrained cordiality, Purbright took his leave. He paused at the door, glancing once more toward the writing desk. You said Mrs. Pell disliked direct speech, he remarked to Cora. Did she also dislike direct action? Cora blinked. I don't understand. She seems to have preferred the indirect method. Notes, rules, and labels. Very Flaxborough. We like our honesty labelled for storage. When he left, Mrs. Loxby closed the door firmly behind him. The street outside was quiet, a faint drizzle flattening what passed for cheerfulness. Sergeant Love waited in the car, smoking with the guiltless expression of a man convinced no one would notice. Find anything, sir? He asked, as Purbright settled beside him. A bottle labelled Do Not Use, which in Flaxborough is practically an invitation. Love frowned. Poison, you think? Purbright leaned back. Possibly. More likely pride. Mrs. Pell seems to have bottled her opinions as carefully as her marmalade. He paused. Still, one does not die from disapproval, at least not immediately. Love gave a small laugh that died quickly. Funny sort of place, this. Everyone polite as priests, but you can tell they're watching. Yes, said Purbright. In Flaxborough, silence is the local dialect. That evening, in his office, Purbright placed the contents of his investigation in an orderly row. The borrowed ledger, the list of institute members, the name of the refuse collector, and a note of Mrs. Pell's peculiar bottle. The facts, though few, had begun to align in a manner that irritated him. Too neat, too—
Flaxborough. He was still regarding them when Superintendent Chubb appeared at the door. Evening, Purbright. You're still at it. Thought that Pell business was natural causes. So it was, said Purbright, until the town began to behave unnaturally. Chubb frowned. Meaning what? Meaning no one in Flaxborough minds a death, provided it stays tidy. But this one refuses to fold itself away. Someone's been smoothing the sheets too soon. Chubb sighed. You and your metaphors. Just don't go turning a case of bad jam into murder. I shouldn't dream of it, Purbright replied mildly. Though, of course, dreams are the only honest things left here. Late that night, the constable on duty delivered a small paper parcel found at the station door. It bore no note, only a neat label in the same narrow hand that had once marked jars and ledgers. To Inspector Purbright, necessary. Inside was the envelope he had seen earlier at Mrs. Pell's house, now unsealed. Within lay a single sheet of paper on which were written 4 words in her uncompromising script. They will taste it. Purbright read the words twice, then folded the paper carefully back into its envelope. He sat for a long while, staring at the window where the drizzle had turned to fine mist. At last, he said quietly, to no one in particular, "Yes, they probably will." Then he placed the envelope beside the other items on his desk, aligned its corners neatly, and switched off the light. By Wednesday morning, the Flaxborough Gazette and Informer arrived with its usual punctuality, though its contents seemed unusually conscientious in the wake of Mrs. Pell's passing. The obituary, brief and carefully courteous, had been set with a faintly admiring tone. Beneath it, in the letters to the editor column, appeared a single note, unsigned.
A woman of principle is irreplaceable. May our domestic standards remain uncompromised. Inspector Purbright, reading it over his morning tea, allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile. In Flaxborough, even anonymous sentiment carried its own kind of surveillance. He set the paper aside with a delicate crease, mindful not to disturb its neat lines, and called Sergeant Love over. "Notice anything unusual, Love?" The young constable peered at the page. "Politeness?" "Indeed, but observe the phrasing. Domestic standards. One would not use such words unless addressing a particular readership." Love blinked. "You mean the Institute?" "Exactly, and whoever wrote this knows something of Mrs. Pell's concerns, or wishes us to think so." Later that morning, Purbright strolled past the post office, where the editor of the Gazette, Mr. Berridge, had promised to meet him discreetly. The air was damp, and the cobbles glistened with the faint sheen of recent rain. He found the editor behind his desk, red-eyed but otherwise composed, and gesturing vaguely toward a pile of unsorted letters. "Inspector," said Mr. Berridge, "I hope you'll forgive the appearance of chaos. The post has been particularly diligent this week." "Diligent, yes," Purbright replied, selecting a chair that creaked under his weight but conformed to accepted standards of propriety. "Mr. Berridge, I am interested in the letters Mrs. Pell submitted but which were never printed." The editor nodded gravely. They were, in my judgment, potentially inflammatory, though, to be fair, she never accused anyone by name. She preferred implications, as was her habit." "Implications?" Purbright repeated. "A delicate form of accusation. How many letters are we speaking of?" "3, said Berridge, "all within the past month." Purbright's gaze drifted to the stack. He picked up the first letter carefully, observing the meticulous script. Each word was weighed as if for moral rather than linguistic effect. To the editor, "It is a duty in a town of domestic diligence to ensure that competitions reflect honesty. I suspect certain entries may be, how shall I say, embellished." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Embellished? Curious phrasing." "Indeed," said Berridge. "I consulted the solicitor. He recommended against publication. Too vague, yet too suggestive. I suspect Mrs. Pell intended the reader to know more than I did." Purbright nodded. "And the other letters?" "They continued in the same vein," Berridge replied. "She hinted that certain members of the Institute were less meticulous than appearances suggest, and suggested that oversight might be necessary. All unsigned." "Prudent," said Purbright, "but revealing. Anonymous warnings can be a subtle instrument of social pressure." "Exactly my concern," said Berridge. "Too subtle for the town to ignore, too polite to print. I shan't pretend I understood her fully." Purbright folded the letters back with care. "I imagine we will need to speak with the Institute members themselves. Privately, of course. Flaxborough thrives on propriety, not publicity." "Yes, Inspector," Berridge agreed. "I can give you their addresses if necessary." Purbright thanked him and rose. On the way out, he paused to observe the small notice board by the window, where a hand-typed announcement had been pinned. "Upcoming committee meeting. Discussion. Deferred." A deliberate omission, thought Purbright, meant to reassure the anxious while leaving enough room for speculation. By late afternoon, Purbright was at the back room of the Institute Hall, examining the correspondence once more. Miss Teetle had returned, claiming she wished to assist in cataloguing the letters for posterity. She seemed to hover near the door, as though her presence might be required only to lend legitimacy to the exercise. "You know, Inspector," she said, "Mrs. Pell was persistent. She did not write without reason. Every note had a purpose." "Even if that purpose was never stated?" Purbright asked, gently turning a sheet. "Yes, even then," she replied. He allowed a moment of silence,
observing how her hands fidgeted with the corner of a note. Politeness, as always, masked a tension she did not entirely control. "Were any of the letters intended to alarm?" he asked. She shook her head, though her lips pressed thinly. "Not alarm, exactly. Guidance, perhaps. I think she hoped someone would notice." Purbright nodded. "And did they?" Miss Teetle did not answer directly. Across town, Mrs. Tyndall was performing her own brand of subtle observation. At the post office, she had been seen collecting a small parcel of oranges from Mr. Blodder, the fruit vendor, with unusual care. The oranges were carefully wrapped, inspected, and placed in her basket as though each one carried a moral responsibility. Purbright, having learned of this from Sergeant Love, made a mental note. Flaxborough's domestic life was a web of such gestures, small, precise, socially freighted. He understood that the arrival of these oranges was unlikely to be trivial. By the time he returned to the Institute, the afternoon light had faded to a soft, grey drizzle. The letters were stacked neatly on the table, their edges aligned, their contents whispering of implication, suspicion, and caution. He noted the absence of one particular envelope, the one marked for immediate attention, which Mrs. Pell had often referred to when speaking of delicate matters. "Missing?" asked Love, observing the gap. "Mislaid, perhaps," Purbright said, "or removed with care. Either explanation fits the usual patterns here." Love frowned. "Who would remove it?" "Someone with both motive and taste," Purbright said. "Flaxborough rarely suffers indiscretion. It prefers careful concealment." Later, Purbright and Love visited Mr. Berridge at the Gazette again. The editor offered tea, though the inspector declined. He asked casually about the letter's reception among the staff. "They were handled, of course, with the utmost confidentiality," said Berridge. Still some murmuring occurred. Typists wondered at her diligence, the sub-editor remarked upon her sense of justice. "Nothing serious. The staff respect the dead, you understand." "Of course," said Purbright. "Flaxborough staff, like its committees, values propriety above all." "Precisely," said Berridge, though some did wonder why she singled out certain competitors. "But these are idle questions." Purbright made a note. Idle questions rarely remain idle in this town. Returning to the station, Purbright reviewed the letters once more, arranging them in order of submission. He noted a pattern. Each letter corresponded roughly to dates of competitions, and each hinted obliquely at potential irregularities. What particularly caught his attention was a reference repeated in each, the term Batch B, a subtle annotation that Mrs. Pell had used with deliberate economy. "Batch B," he murmured to himself. "That is worth noting." Love, standing by the window and watching the street darken, asked, "Batch B? Do you mean the marmalade?" "Yes," said Purbright. She was always precise. "The B designation recurs. Repetition in Flaxborough often signifies importance or disapproval." The inspector's eyes lingered over the words. They were small, innocuous letters on a page, yet they seemed to hum with intent, much as Mrs. Pell herself had hummed while lining up her jars for inspection. "Could it be anything serious?" Love ventured. "Serious," Purbright said softly, "is a matter of perspective. In Flaxborough, the serious often masquerades as trivial, and the trivial can ruin reputations." He leaned back in his chair, the lamp casting an even circle of light over the letters. The faint scent of paper and ink mingled with the memory of marmalade sweetness, now turning slightly bitter in the mind. "Observe, Sergeant," he said, "that no one yet speaks openly of Batch B. Its absence from public discussion is a form of caution, and where caution exists, curiosity will follow." Love nodded, though he appeared unconvinced. Purbright, in a rare moment of inward reflection, allowed himself a faint smile. Even the letters properly catalogued and politely read were not sufficient to contain the moral algebra of Flaxborough. The town had its rules, and Mrs. Pell's posthumous communications were already testing them. A faint knock at the door broke the moment. The constable entered with another small parcel, this one unmarked. Purbright opened it carefully. Inside was a single, unopened letter bearing the same precise handwriting. Observe the sweetness. Judgment may follow. He held it lightly between his fingers, noting the faint, almost imperceptible aroma of oranges. "Yes," he said quietly. "They probably will." And in that quiet pronouncement, the day's subtle disturbances gathered around him, as tidy, fragile, and ominous as the jars on Mrs. Pell's shelves, still lingering in memory. It was the kind of morning that Flaxborough considered exemplary, overcast enough to excuse lingering in bed, but bright enough to suggest activity without impropriety. Inspector Purbright arrived at the town hall just before the appointed hour for the judge's tea. A small gathering convened ostensibly to review the results of the recent preserves competition, but, in practice, an opportunity to rehearse reputations and rehearse them carefully. The room smelled faintly of china and brewed tea, overlaid with the sharper undertone of past deliberations, sugar dust, hints of lemon zest, and the residual pride of prior victories. The tables were set with ceremonial precision, saucers aligned, spoons facing north, small notes at each place indicating which judges were permitted to speak first. Purbright found his chair and seated himself with measured civility. Sergeant Love was already present, nervously adjusting his cuffs and keeping a watchful eye on the small gatherings of committee members and competitors assembling. The first to arrive was Mrs. Tyndall, whose ribbon from the produce fair, despite being officially retired for this season, seemed to assert itself across her chest with discreet insistence. She exchanged civil greetings with the vicar's wife, Mrs. Loxby, who had taken on the dual role of hostess and moral auditor. "Inspector," Mrs. Loxby said, inclining her head, "I trust you find the arrangement satisfactory." "Impeccable," Purbright replied, surveying the room. "The seating alone suggests a great deal about perceived competence." Mrs. Loxby smiled faintly. "Perceived, yes, though in Flaxborough perception is almost as valuable as reality." A murmur of agreement rippled through the small group. Miss Teetle arrived next, carrying a small notebook and a faintly nervous air. Her place at the table was marked, as always, with careful attention to protocol. She bowed lightly to the inspector, who nodded in acknowledgement. "I trust you enjoyed the previous meeting?" Purbright asked. Miss Teetle hesitated. "It was informative. Indeed, I have always found that meetings often reveal more about people than about procedure." Tea was served in the usual Flaxborough fashion, carefully, politely, and with a precise avoidance of conversation that might disturb reputations. Small cakes were laid out, each with subtle differences indicating which household had produced them. Purbright took a modest slice of sponge, observing the reactions of those around him with unhurried interest. Mrs. Tyndall, placing her cup with ritual care, commented softly to the group. "It is remarkable, is it not, how even a competition of marmalade and jam can illuminate character?" Miss Teetle's hands trembled slightly over her teacup. "Yes," she said. "People do reveal themselves in small ways." Purbright sipped his tea and allowed a slow silence to follow. "Indeed, the seemingly trivial can disclose more than the officially important." Mrs. Loxby, ever vigilant of tone and propriety, inclined her head. "Quite so, Inspector. Though one must be careful not to infer too much. Inference can be misleading." "Of course," Purbright said, "but only if one lacks observation." The conversation drifted gently toward the competition itself. Mrs. Tyndall spoke of her batch with the faintest air of modest pride. "The colour was, I believe, correct. I followed my usual method precisely. Purbright allowed a moment of silence, watching for the micro-reactions of those nearby. Miss Teetle cleared her throat. Yes, colour is important, but texture and flavour must be considered together. Mrs. Tyndall glanced at her, the faintest edge of irritation passing unnoticed by all but the inspector. Certainly, she said, though consistency is hardly less significant. The discussion proceeded with careful politeness, each participant asserting propriety, modesty, or correctness, as suits the town's customs. Purbright noted the subtle tension beneath the courtesy, a sense that each remark was weighed not merely for truth, but for potential social consequences. "And the judge's decisions," said Mrs. Loxby, "were unanimous, I hope?" "Yes, of course," Miss Teetle replied, though there was minor debate over the Batch B entry. Purbright's interest piqued. "Batch B?" Miss Teetle looked embarrassed. It was, different, unusual texture, perhaps slight bitterness. Dorcas mentioned it had potential for improvement. "Potential," said Purbright, quietly. "Or warning." Mrs. Tyndall set down her cup abruptly. "I should think that Mrs. Pell had very high standards. One ought not to exaggerate minor imperfections." "Precisely," said Purbright. "And yet exaggeration often masquerades as careful note." A faint silence fell. The room was conscious of its own propriety, aware that criticism, even polite, could unsettle the delicate equilibrium of Flaxborough's reputations. The tea continued with small, meticulous rituals, sugar stirred thrice, teapots refilled according to rank, and each remark delivered with a subtle awareness of its social cost. Purbright, observing, made small mental notes. Mrs. Tyndall's hand occasionally trembled. Miss Teetle's gaze kept flicking toward the notebook where the inspector had earlier seen her record judge's comments. Mrs. Loxby maintained a calm, even expression, yet her fingers drummed the table ever so slightly. "It is curious," Purbright said finally, "how the absence of Dorcas Pell can make such a presence felt. One might almost imagine her directing these proceedings from beyond." "Indeed," said Mrs. Loxby, not entirely without a shiver of agreement. "Her notes were always so thorough." "Thoroughness," Purbright continued, "can sometimes be a kind of judgment in itself." Miss Teetle made a small, almost inaudible sound of assent. When the tea had concluded and the guests began to rise, Purbright lingered. He requested permission to examine the table arrangements more closely. Mrs. Loxby acquiesced, a faint frown creasing her brow. "Inspector, I do hope you are not implying any impropriety among our members." "Imply nothing," Purbright said smoothly. "I observe only the traces left by careful hands." He noted the placement of each cup, the slight staining of the saucers, and the crumbs that had fallen near the edge of the table. Most were ordinary, yet near the position marked for Batch B, a faint smear of amber jam caught his attention. It was too small to have been noticed in the bustle, yet distinct. "You see this, Sergeant?" he said, pointing with the tip of his pencil. Love leaned forward. "Jam?" "Exactly, but consider the placement. Too deliberate to be accidental, perhaps left for inspection or warning." Mrs. Tyndall, who had lingered near the table, stiffened slightly. Purbright noticed the minute tightening of her jaw. Miss Teetle, observing, covered her mouth with a gloved hand, as though containing a reaction that might be deemed improper. Purbright made a mental note. In Flaxborough, gestures like this often carried more meaning than words. As the final guests departed, Mrs. Loxby insisted on accompanying Purbright to the door. "I trust the tea met your expectations," she said, her tone faintly defensive. "Exceeding them," he replied. "Though in Flaxborough, one always expects the unexpected under the guise of the ordinary." Outside, the drizzle had returned, making the cobbles shine like wet enamel. Love waited patiently, as ever, and followed the inspector in silence. "I wonder," Purbright said softly, "how many noticed the smear at the Batch B place?" "Do you mean Mrs. Tyndall?" Love asked. "Perhaps. Or perhaps someone else entirely. What is certain is that the gesture was deliberate, subtle, and observed. And in Flaxborough, subtle observation is the first step towards social reckoning." Love frowned. "A warning? Possibly. Or a message. In this town, one seldom acts without considering the consequences. The consequences themselves are often invisible, yet they shape behavior more effectively than any reprimand." He paused, lifting his gaze to the foggy street. "I suspect Batch B will prove to be more than a mere entry, and the attention it receives, careful, polite attention, may reveal far more than we anticipate." Back at the station, Purbright set the notebook and letters before him. The faint smear of jam lingered in his memory, a tiny trace of something tangible amid the meticulous layers of propriety, observation, and etiquette. He considered the participants of the tea, each gesture, each hesitation, and each polite exchange. In Flaxborough, it was the smallest evidence, crumbs, stains, glances, that often spoke the loudest. He picked up the sheet referencing Batch B from the ledger. The words seemed suddenly weighty, heavy with implication, their meaning extending beyond mere taste. "Yes," he murmured to himself, "there is a story in every jar, and someone is watching who ought not to be." Outside, the drizzle continued unremarkable, almost polite in its persistence. And within the quiet of his office, Purbright made a careful note. The first tangible trace, perhaps trivial to some, now a fulcrum for observation, had emerged, one smear, one hesitation, and one question that would not go away. Flaxborough afternoons had a habit of arriving slowly, like tea steeping in a pot that had been left on the hob for just long enough to invite reflection, but not yet bitterness. It was in such a climate that Inspector Purbright found himself at the Daintree residence, summoned by a brief note left on his desk the previous evening. Visitors today. Unscheduled. Important. C.D. Cora. Daintree's sitting room was modest, tidy in an almost apologetic manner, and scented faintly of lavender, the residue of a household that valued order above exuberance. She greeted Purbright with her habitual air of cautious surprise, as though expecting a guest at any moment was a breach of decorum. "Inspector," she said, inclining her head, "they are due shortly. I hope this will not inconvenience you." "Not at all," he replied, settling into an armchair with the sort of diffident elegance Flaxborough demanded of visitors. "I should like to observe. That is all." The first to arrive was Mr. Tulby, the refuse collector. He was accompanied by a smaller man whose name Cora supplied with some hesitation, Mr. Pindar, a chemist of uncertain reputation and precise dress. Tulby carried the air of a man accustomed to quiet work, though the weight of being summoned to someone's parlour seemed to press upon him more than any sack of refuse ever had. Purbright noted their entry with mild interest, observing the subtle adjustments of posture, the careful avoidance of eye contact, and the polite bow that Tulby offered to Cora, as though she were a figure of authority far beyond familial connection. "Good afternoon, Inspector," said Tulby. "Miss Daintree, I hope you are well." "All is well," Cora replied, though her hands twisted slightly in her lap. Once introductions were made, Purbright indicated that he would remain silent unless needed. The conversation began with the usual formalities, weather, church attendance, and the minor disruption caused by the recent rain. Then Tulby, after a thoughtful pause, spoke. "I understand you wish to review the refuse from Mrs. Pell's household, Inspector. I brought the list." He handed over a small notebook, its pages clean and neat, enumerating dates, items collected, and occasional notes. Purbright scanned it quickly. There was nothing extraordinary until he reached the entry for Tuesday, the day the spoiled jars had been removed. Next to it, in Talby's neat handwriting, was a single annotation, Batch B, not examined. "Interesting," Purbright murmured. "You did not examine Batch B?" Talby shook his head. "No, ma'am. I was instructed only to remove spoilage. That jar was noted differently, and I was told not to open it." Purbright's eyes lingered on the entry. Instructions in Flaxborough were rarely ambiguous, and adherence was almost ritualistic. Yet the very existence of a jar set apart suggested the careful hands of someone who expected scrutiny. "And the chemist?" Purbright said, turning his attention to Mr. Pindar. "Ah," said Pindar, speaking with the measured politeness of someone unused to social improvisation. "I am here to advise, if necessary, on the contents of jars in question. I understand there may have been concern about spoilage or contamination." Talby coughed, politely. "Inspector, I did not see the need to involve him until requested." Purbright made a small note. In Flaxborough, experts were summoned to confirm propriety rather than to investigate wrongdoing. The discussion drifted carefully around Batch B, without anyone yet committing to a definitive statement. Purbright observed the subtle shifts in posture and tone, the little silences that indicated suppressed knowledge. "It was unusual," Pindar said finally, "but within the bounds of preservation. Slight bitterness, but perhaps intended. I would hesitate to call it spoiled." Mrs. Loxby's soft voice intruded from the doorway. She had arrived quietly, as if summoned by intuition rather than by letter. "Inspector, I trust we are not implying negligence?" Purbright shook his head. "No, only that subtle differences warrant attention. In Flaxborough, attention is often mistaken for accusation, and accusation for scandal." Talby looked uncomfortable, while Pindar adjusted his spectacles. "I see," the chemist said carefully. "Then perhaps the jar should remain noted, but unexamined further." "Exactly," Purbright replied. "Observation is often sufficient. Action may follow, but only if necessary." Cora Daintree brought tea quietly, allowing the conversation to continue without interruption. She placed a tray near Purbright, and the inspector noted the precise alignment of cups and spoons, a subtle echo of the judge's tea, almost ritualistic in its propriety. Miss Teetle, who had arrived unexpectedly midway through the discussion, now hovered at the corner of the room. Her eyes were wide, her hands clutching a small notebook. She seemed intent on recording each nuance, though none had requested it. Purbright observed her quietly. She was a creature of habit and conscience, entirely Flaxboroughian in her meticulous attentiveness. The subtle quiver in her lips suggested anxiety, or perhaps the moral pressure of witnessing what might be improprieties she had long suspected but never confirmed. "Inspector," she said softly, "I wondered whether the jar might have been tampered with." Talby coughed again. Miss Teetle. "Perhaps not," she corrected quickly. "I merely—" Purbright held up a hand. "Not to worry, Miss Teetle. Speculation is harmless when restrained. Observation is paramount." Her shoulders slumped slightly, a minor concession to relief. The inspector turned his attention to the chemist again. "Mr. Pindar, would you be willing to inspect the jar here?" Pindar hesitated, glancing at Talby, who made a faint motion of acquiescence. The jar, retrieved carefully from its hiding place, was small, sealed, and marked with Mrs. Pell's familiar meticulous handwriting, "Batch B, do not taste." Pindar lifted it gingerly, turning it in the light. "Nothing appears amiss," he said finally. "The liquid is consistent, the lid intact. no discoloration. Smell is faintly citrus, typical of the preserve. Yet we remain concerned, Purbright said quietly. Not for spoilage, but for propriety. Flaxborough observes carefully, and the moral weight of a jar can exceed its culinary value. Cora Daintree's hands trembled slightly as she held the tray of tea. Talby shifted uneasily, and Miss Teetle scribbled notes with unsteady penmanship. "Do you mean," Mrs. Loxby asked carefully, "that we are in danger of moral error?" Purbright smiled faintly. "In Flaxborough, moral error is rarely dangerous. It is, however, informative." After a pause, he instructed Pindar to replace the jar in its hiding place and Talby to note the inspection in his ledger. Each complied with the gravity befitting a small-town ritual. The visitors lingered, and Purbright observed them in their ordinary, unassuming ways. Talby's glances toward the door suggested he wished to leave, yet politeness restrained him. Pindar's meticulous attention to the jar betrayed a nervous conscientiousness, while Miss Teetle's insistence on recording every gesture suggested anticipation of consequence, however faint. Cora Daintree's eyes met Purbright's briefly. She seemed to ask, without words, whether the ordinary world would remain undisturbed, or whether her aunt's posthumous influence would extend further than decorum permitted. Purbright, in his usual quiet fashion, only inclined his head. The answer was not his to provide. As the visitors departed, Purbright noted the minor gestures that had gone unremarked. Talby's hesitation at the gate, Pindar's careful adjustment of his spectacles, and Miss Teetle's lingering gaze at the jar's hidden location. Each acted as if the day's events had subtly altered their perception of propriety, a shift as imperceptible as the settling of dust on a well-polished table. The inspector made a small mental note. Someone, somewhere, had taken extraordinary care to leave a trace, yet conceal its import. Flaxborough's social network was quietly taut, every gesture monitored, every observation catalogued. Back at the station, Purbright and Love reviewed the day's findings. The jar itself had yielded no evidence of spoilage or tampering, yet the behaviours surrounding it were telling: anxiety, hesitation, and careful observation that bordered on ritual. "Batch B," Purbright said quietly, "is not a problem of taste nor even of risk. It is a problem of anticipation. Someone expects attention to be paid, and Flaxborough, as always, obliges." Love frowned. "So we have a jar, a few nervous people, and nothing else?" "Precisely," Purbright said. "Nothing else of consequence, yet everything matters. In Flaxborough, the moral climate is often more telling than physical evidence, and Batch B has shifted that climate." He leaned back in his chair, gazing at the notebook where Talby had recorded the inspection. The faint traces of handwriting, the careful spacing of lines, the annotations of what was and was not observed, they all pointed to a deliberate choreography of propriety and suspicion. "Yes," he murmured, almost to himself. "The taste of judgment has already begun, and someone will discover it soon enough." Outside, the drizzle had returned, softening the edges of the town. Within the quiet of the station, Purbright allowed a faint smile. Batch B had not yet spoken its full significance, but its presence, the careful, polite attention it had drawn, was the first true pivot in the moral story of Flaxborough, and in Flaxborough, pivots, however slight, are never without consequence. The town hall was, as always, arranged with meticulous attention to hierarchy. Chairs lined the walls with silent precision, tables polished to the sort of gleaming restraint that Flaxborough prized, and each nameplate aligned exactly with the expected seating protocol. Inspector Purbright arrived half an hour before the meeting, his coat damp from a light drizzle, and took his seat in the rear, where he could observe without intrusion. Sergeant Love followed, carrying the faintly officious air of someone assigned to witness propriety rather than influence it. The meeting convened with almost ritualistic formality. Mrs. Loxby presided as chair, her posture impeccably erect, the arch of her eyebrows conveying both authority and gentle reproach to any hint of impertinence. She called the gathering to order, and the assembled members of the Committee of Domestic Excellence adjusted their papers, pens, and spectacles in anticipation of discussion. "Inspector Purbright," Mrs. Loxby began, "we are grateful for your presence. Though not a formal member, your observations are always enlightening." Purbright inclined his head. "I am most obliged, Mrs. Loxby. I shall endeavour to remain only an observer." Yet even as he spoke, he noted the subtle currents in the room. A slight fidgeting by Mrs. Tyndall, Miss Teetle's careful notes, and the faint tightening of hands among the other members. In Flaxborough, observation alone could provoke unease. The first order of business was the recent preserves competition. A few polite words of congratulation passed, carefully balanced with reminders that integrity in judging remained paramount. The discussion inevitably turned to Batch B, its absence from prior scrutiny creating a tension that was almost imperceptible, yet palpable to Purbright's trained eye. Mrs. Tyndall cleared her throat. "Regarding the judging of Batch B," she said, "I am confident that no harm has been done. However, we must consider the possibility that attention, unintended attention, might have influenced perceptions." Miss Teetle's pen hovered above her notebook. "Perhaps, Mrs. Tyndall, we should clarify that no one has yet tasted or altered the batch since inspection." "Precisely," said Purbright softly. "Observation is distinct from interference, yet both may carry consequences." A silence fell, polite and deliberate, the sort that stretched in Flaxborough until it became a statement in itself. Mrs. Loxby moved the discussion to housekeeping matters, the upcoming charity sale, the proper labelling of jellies, and the rotation of committee duties. Purbright listened carefully, noting how each speaker maintained a veneer of civility while subtly asserting hierarchy and competence. Even minor differences in pronunciation or phrasing became a measure of status. In this town, moral and social judgment were closely entwined. "Inspector," Mrs. Loxby said after a pause, "perhaps you might comment on procedural adherence during the last judging." Purbright allowed a faint smile. "I can only observe that all appears in order, though one might note the degree to which politeness conceals unease, and that in itself may be informative." Mrs. Tyndall's lips pursed ever so slightly. Miss Teetle scribbled furiously. The other members exchanged glances subtle enough to escape anyone less practiced in Flaxborough's etiquette. Discussion inevitably returned to the posthumous effects of Mrs. Pell. Notes from her ledger were circulated discreetly, not read aloud but laid before each member for silent perusal. Purbright observed the reactions. Mrs. Tyndall's eyes flickered, Miss Teetle's hands tightened on her notebook, and the vicar's wife maintained a calm exterior while her fingers drummed lightly on the table. Purbright lifted one of the notes. It contained a single, concise admonition regarding the oversight of preserves. Batch B must be watched. Proper attention required. Do not fail. "Strong words," he murmured. Miss Teetle glanced at him. "She was always so exacting." "Exacting indeed," Purbright said, "and yet she trusted the community's conscience to act on her intentions." Mrs. Loxby's eyes briefly met his. "We must hope that intention and observation coincide." The meeting advanced to reports from subcommittees. Each speaker was polite, careful not to appear critical, yet each report subtly suggested that minor lapses, whether in cleanliness, labelling, or presentation, were noted and catalogued. Purbright, with his habitual attentiveness, recorded these gestures as carefully as the spoken words. He noted in particular that the subcommittee responsible for the storage of preserves had omitted any reference to Batch B. Their report was impeccable, yet incomplete, a small sign of oversight or discretion. In Flaxborough, the two were often indistinguishable. "Inspector," said Mrs. Loxby during a break, "your insight might be appreciated regarding the archival procedures. Are they sufficiently rigorous?" Purbright considered the ledger and the placement of the jars. "Archival rigour seems sound," he said, "though rigour alone does not prevent the moral consequences of error. One might misplace a jar and preserve its reputation, or preserve a jar and misplace its reputation. Flaxborough watches both outcomes closely." Mrs. Loxby inclined her head. "Indeed, both are of consequence." After the break, the meeting resumed, focusing on anticipated competitions and the need for exacting documentation. Purbright's eyes swept the room, noting the micro-expressions that passed among members, whispered asides, a faint tightening of lips, subtle glances toward the central table where Batch B would soon be reconsidered. Mrs. Tyndall cleared her throat. "Regarding the committee's integrity, I trust all members observe due diligence." "Without doubt," Purbright said, "though diligence, as we have seen, is often a matter of perception as much as practice." Miss Teetle's pen paused, then resumed, her handwriting slightly more hurried. Purbright noted it, filing away the small indication of anxiety. Even in Flaxborough, the appearance of routine could conceal apprehension. The meeting concluded with the customary expressions of gratitude and assurance. Chairs were arranged, papers folded, and members rose with a subtle choreography of politeness. Yet Purbright noted, as always, what was unsaid. The gentle hesitation in Mrs. Tyndall's steps, Miss Teetle's final glance at the central table, the slight lingering of Mrs. Loxby's hands on the lectern. As the members departed, Purbright lingered, requesting a moment with Cora Daintree. She appeared, hands folded, and with a faintly uneasy expression. "Miss Daintree," he said quietly, "I trust your visitors found the meeting instructive?" Cora hesitated. "They were attentive. Perhaps more so than expected." Purbright allowed a slow nod. "And did anyone act in a way that suggested concern beyond ordinary prudence?" She considered this carefully. Stapindar looked at the ledger and then at the jar. "I think he was curious, perhaps too curious." "Curiosity is rarely harmful," Purbright said, "though in Flaxborough the right sort of curiosity carries its own weight." Cora inclined her head. "Yes, I understand." After leaving Daintree House, Purbright and Sergeant Love walked slowly through the drizzle, which had returned to soften the streets of the town. "Batch B, sir," Love said at last, "seems to be at the centre of everyone's attention, but there's nothing wrong with it, is there?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Nothing wrong, perhaps, in a culinary sense. Yet the reactions, hesitation, attention, subtle anxiety, tell us more than any taste test ever could. Flaxborough's concern is moral, reputational. The jar is innocent, the perception is not." "Do you think someone will act?" Love asked, uncertain. "Someone always acts," Purbright replied softly, "though often in ways no one expects, and someone else will notice. The question is not if, but how." They paused beneath a lamp-post. The pool of light reflected off the wet cobbles, and Purbright's gaze drifted toward the windows of Daintree House. Inside, Cora's silhouette lingered near the central table, hands folded, posture careful. "Yes," Purbright murmured, almost to himself. "The stage is set, and Flaxborough, as ever, will observe." He noted the faint scent of citrus in the damp air, a subtle reminder of the preserved batch that had instigated such attention. Even in death, Mrs. Pell's meticulous care had orchestrated a performance that demanded observation, and the audience, civil, polite, and unyielding, was already in place. A soft question lingered in Purbright's mind as they continued their walk. Who among them will misinterpret the message, and who will understand its subtle instruction? In Flaxborough, judgment was always performed silently, yet its consequences were rarely invisible. Evening in Flaxborough descended with the deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness the town favoured. Street lamps glowed behind misted panes, casting long, neat shadows over cobbled pavements. Inspector Purbright returned to his office, leaving Sergeant Love to wander the streets on routine patrol, ostensibly to check lamps and doors, but in practice to absorb the town's quiet rhythms. On his desk lay a small stack of letters, each with the elegant, familiar handwriting of Mrs. Pell. They had arrived anonymously, delivered by the post in envelopes that bore no indication of origin, as though the deceased woman herself had arranged the correspondence from beyond. Purbright set them aside for now, drawing the evening lamp closer, the pool of light illuminating dust motes like tiny, hovering jurors. He poured a cup of tea and allowed himself a moment of reflection. Flaxborough, he noted, rarely acted with suddenness. Instead, it preferred the slow drip of observation, the careful weighing of consequences, and the silent adjudication of minor transgressions. The first letter, addressed simply to the Committee of Domestic Excellence, contained nothing more than a brief admonition. Consider the attention paid to details. A lapse may appear trifling, but carry weight beyond measure. Purbright read it twice, noting the punctuation, the spacing, and the deliberate absence of signature. In Flaxborough, absence was as instructive as presence. To omit one's name implied authority without direct confrontation. He set the letter down and opened the second, slightly thicker. This one concerned Batch B. It was an innocuous note, yet its phrasing carried a peculiar weight. Batch B remains as observed. Let no one assume neglect. Careful scrutiny is expected, even if unacknowledged. Purbright allowed a faint smile. Mrs. Pell's style had not changed. Gentle admonishment, meticulous phrasing, and an ever-present concern for propriety. He glanced toward the window where the evening mist had begun to obscure the familiar outlines of the town. A knock at the door drew him from his thoughts. Sergeant Love entered, carrying an air of formal purpose. Inspector, a visitor has arrived. No appointment, though they requested discretion. Purbright set aside the letters. Very well, show them in. The visitor proved to be Miss Teetle, clutching a small notebook to her chest. Her face was pale, her expression taut, as though she had carried a burden across the town in secret. She bowed slightly and spoke in measured tones. Inspector, I hope to consult with you regarding the letters. I thought it prudent not to read them alone. Purbright gestured toward the desk. By all means, Miss Teetle. Prudence is rarely misplaced. She placed her notebook beside the stack of correspondence. Some of the wording, she said softly, suggests more than simple advice. I fear she intended them to influence actions, perhaps subtly, perhaps indirectly. But in Flaxborough, subtlety carries authority. Quite so, Purbright said, leaning back. Observation and interpretation often matter more than enforcement. They began reviewing the letters together, noting the recurring phrases, careful scrutiny, attention paid, lapses carry weight. Purbright made a mental note of the tone, gentle, precise, and unrelenting in its quiet authority. Miss Teetle read aloud, carefully. Let no action appear negligent nor judgment unconsidered. The eyes of Flaxborough are always upon you. Purbright nodded. The implied audience is as important as the literal one. She writes not merely to the committee, but to anyone with awareness of propriety. Miss Teetle's hands trembled slightly. Even those who might be tempted to ignore her guidance will read between the lines. Precisely, Purbright said. Flaxborough's morality functions as a network. A single observation quietly noted can ripple through the town without uttering a single word aloud. The third letter was perhaps the most intriguing. Unlike the others, it contained what could be described as a suggestion of direct observation. Inspect batch B before the committee convenes. Allow the jar to convey what taste cannot. The unobserved may reveal more than the scrutinized. Purbright allowed the note to rest between his fingers. Here we have instruction masquerading as suggestion. Notice the subtle imperative. Allow the jar to convey. She frames action as observation, subtly shifting responsibility to the beholder. Miss Teetle frowned. Do you mean she anticipated that someone would act? I suspect she did, Purbright said quietly. But the action required is not overt. It is moral, social, even psychological. She has left the stage prepared for observation, and the players must respond according to decorum or misstep entirely. A faint tapping sounded against the window pane, rhythmic, deliberate, almost as if the town itself wished to emphasize the point. Purbright made a note, then stood and moved to the window. Beyond the mist, the shapes of familiar houses suggested a town quietly watching, waiting and weighing itself. The letters in his hand seemed to exert a presence almost corporeal in their subtle authority. Miss Teetle watched him, her eyes bright in the lamp's reflection. "Inspector," she said, almost whispering, "do you think someone will misread the guidance?" "Always a possibility," he replied. "Flaxborough thrives on correct interpretation. Misinterpretation carries consequences, but often invisible ones. That is the elegance of our town." They reviewed the letters once more, noting the frequent references to propriety, observation, and careful scrutiny. Each was crafted to guide, to instruct, yet to avoid overt coercion. Purbright considered the implications, the jar, the committee, the subtle warnings, all interconnected like a lattice. Miss Teetle finally broke the quiet. "Inspector, I noticed a pattern in the dates. The letters coincide with committee meetings, judging sessions and deliveries. She intended them to be present when decisions were made, not merely read in isolation." "Indeed," Purbright said, setting down the final envelope. "Her design is chronological as much as moral. Timing is part of the message. Attention must be paid at specific intervals. Neglect may distort interpretation." He allowed a pause, then continued in a low voice. "And the most interesting question is who among us will notice first, who will act without awareness, and who will maintain the decorum Mrs. Pell intended." Miss Teetle shivered ever so slightly. "Even now, Inspector, her presence is felt. It is remarkable." "Remarkable," he agreed, "and instructive. Observe that the letters are not accusatory, yet they command attention. That is her subtle genius." A quiet knock interrupted them again. This time it was the postman delivering a small package. He handed it to Purbright with careful politeness, then retreated without waiting for acknowledgement. Inside the package was a single small jar, sealed and labelled in Mrs. Pell's familiar hand. "Batch B, observe only." Purbright held the jar lightly, noting the faint aroma, the precise sealing, and the almost imperceptible imperfections in the spread of preserve visible through the glass. Miss Teetle leaned forward, eyes bright with anticipation. "Inspector, it is exactly as the letters describe." "Yes," Purbright said softly. "Observation is required, not interference, and yet the anticipation of observation has already begun to shape behavior." He placed the jar in the center of his desk. The lamp above reflected the amber surface, and in its glow he could almost see the invisible threads of social expectation stretching outward into the town. Miss Teetle hesitated, then spoke. "Do you think someone has already seen it? Perhaps before it arrived here?" Purbright's eyes narrowed slightly. "Perhaps. The package has travelled along familiar channels. Yet perception is selective. One may see the jar and note nothing or note everything. In Flaxborough, it is rarely the object itself, but the reaction to it that carries significance." He allowed a brief silence. Even in the quiet of the office, the faint murmur of the town seemed audible through the walls. The weight of collective observation, so subtle, so disciplined, was tangible in its restraint. Sergeant Love finally spoke. "Inspector, what do we do now? It's a jar, some letters, and a lot of polite anxiety." Purbright allowed a faint, dry smile. "Precisely, and that is enough. The moral landscape has shifted, yet the terrain is invisible. Our task is to watch, to note, and to allow consequences to reveal themselves quietly. In time, even a jar will speak." Miss Teetle glanced from the jar to the letters, then back at Purbright. "And the message? Will we understand it?" Purbright leaned back in his chair. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it will reveal itself slowly through observation and consequence. Flaxborough prefers the long view. Immediate understanding is rarely expected and often undesirable." He tapped the desk lightly, the faint sound echoing in the quiet room. The jar sat between them, innocuous, yet charged with authority and implication. "Yes," Purbright murmured, almost to himself. "The evening brings clarity only to those who observe. And Batch B has begun to speak quietly to all who know how to listen." Outside, the mist thickened, and the sound of distant footsteps along cobbled streets reminded him that Flaxborough's gaze was never idle. Somewhere, someone was watching, noting, interpreting. And the subtle question remained, who will act first and who will misinterpret the lesson entirely? In the stillness of the office, with the amber jar catching the lamp's reflection, Purbright allowed a faint smile. The game was unfolding exactly as it should. The morning air in Flaxborough carried a dampness that seemed almost deliberate, as though the town itself wished to encourage quiet reflection before any ventures of consequence. Inspector Purbright arrived at the station early, noting with his usual meticulous eye the neat alignment of broom handles in the corner, the slight curl of papers on Sergeant Love's desk, and the faint aroma of recently brewed tea, a fragrance that suggested propriety rather than indulgence. Love entered behind him, carrying a small satchel and the air of someone prepared to witness rather than intervene. "Inspector," he said, "a courier delivered a note this morning. No signature. It mentions the jar again." Purbright accepted the envelope and inspected it briefly, noting the familiar hand, the precise spacing, and the quiet insistence of its phrasing. "Observe the reactions today. The jar will reveal more than words. Note gestures, not statements." He allowed a faint smile. Mrs. Pell, even posthumously, continued to orchestrate the moral theatre of Flaxborough. The plan for the day was simple in outline, yet delicate in execution. Batch B, accompanied by the subtle aura of authority embedded in its amber content, was to be reintroduced before the committee at the town hall, ostensibly for review and cataloguing. Purbright understood, as did Miss Teetle, who had arrived early, notebook clutched tightly, that the true significance lay not in tasting or handling, but in observing the responses, the subtle betrayals of propriety that might appear in the behaviour of otherwise disciplined citizens. At the hall, the committee assembled with careful adherence to hierarchy and protocol. Mrs. Loxby presided, her expression calm, though Purbright noticed the faint lift of an eyebrow as she regarded the inspector. The usual social choreography unfolded, chairs were adjusted, papers shuffled, and a polite silence descended as everyone assumed their preordained positions. Miss Teetle's eyes were keen, tracing the minutiae, the slight flush on Mrs. Tyndall's cheek as she approached the table, the precise angle at which the vicar's wife rested her hands, the subtle tightening of fingers on pens as if to anchor themselves in propriety. Purbright observed all without comment, allowing the room to perform its ritual. He placed batch B in the center of the table, the amber preserve catching the subdued morning light through the tall windows. It was an ordinary jar, yet laden with expectation, and already the room seemed to respond to it. "Shall we review the entry?" Mrs. Loxby said, her tone polite, her posture perfect. Miss Teetle made a subtle note. The words review and entry were deliberate choices, ceremonial as much as practical. Purbright nodded, acknowledging the observation without comment. Mrs. Tyndall leaned forward slightly, her voice tempered with practiced civility. "It is unusual, is it not, to have an entry observed so long after collection?" "Indeed," Purbright said softly. "But in Flaxborough, the weight of observation often exceeds that of the original act." The vicar's wife inclined her head. "One might almost consider it a moral lesson." "Or an exercise in prudence," Purbright corrected, "depending on which observer you consult." Miss Teetle scribbled, capturing not merely the words, but the subtle shifts in tone and posture. Even the faint hesitation before each remark carried meaning, a hesitation shaped as much by propriety as by conscience. As the committee proceeded, Purbright noted patterns emerging. Mrs. Tyndall's eyes repeatedly flicked toward the jar, then toward Miss Teetle, as though measuring the younger woman's reactions. The vicar's wife maintained a calm exterior, yet the slight tapping of her fingers betrayed attention sharpened into subtle anxiety. Other members nodded at expected intervals, yet their glances toward the jar suggested curiosity restrained by decorum. Purbright allowed the observation to continue, aware that the most telling movements were rarely audible. A raised eyebrow, a small intake of breath, a hand moved closer to a pen. All were indicators of the moral tension Mrs. Pell had left behind. "Inspector," Mrs. Loxby said, almost under her breath, "your thoughts on procedural adherence?" Purbright inclined his head. "Impeccable in execution, yet the moral choreography is far from complete. Even the best trained observer may misstep, for it is intention that is now under scrutiny, not merely performance." The room fell silent, each member acutely conscious of the layers of observation pressing upon them. At a deliberate moment, Purbright spoke again. "Batch B is not to be tasted today. Its role is to elicit judgment, to reveal character, not to provide nourishment. Observe only." A subtle shift passed through the room. Miss Teetle's pen stilled briefly, Mrs. Tyndall's posture straightened as if bracing for evaluation, and the vicar's wife's fingers stopped drumming. Even those who maintained the most decorous exterior could not completely mask the sense of scrutiny embedded in the jar's presence. Purbright noted every gesture. The room, he realized, was performing a slow-motion revelation. Those who upheld propriety with ease, those who struggled, and those whose anxiety betrayed a hidden impatience with moral exactitude. A gentle cough drew his attention. It came from the rear, where a younger member of the committee, new to such ceremonies, had arrived with tentative curiosity. She glanced at the jar, then down at her papers, then around the room, her behavior revealing a blend of fascination and fear of social reprisal. Purbright observed the subtle consequences of her hesitation, the micro-adjustments of posture in those seated near her, the faint narrowing of eyes as they watched her conduct herself. "See," Purbright murmured to Miss Teetle. "The newcomer's uncertainty acts like a prism. Each observer reflects the light differently, and each reflection reveals more than any committee discussion ever could." Miss Teetle nodded, her expression bright with realization. Even a small gesture can expose character. "Precisely," Purbright replied. After several minutes of this careful observation, Purbright allowed a slight shift in focus. He asked each member to consider the archival log, a task they performed in precise silence. Even as they recorded information, he noted micro-expressions, Mrs. Tyndall's eyes lingering on the jar before writing, Miss Teetle double-checking figures, the vicar's wife adjusting her pen as though to steady herself against temptation. "Inspection of records," Purbright said softly, "can be as revealing as inspection of the object itself. Integrity manifests in attention to detail, even when unnoticed by others." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle, like a carefully laid stone in a formal garden. At the conclusion of the session, the committee rose, arranging chairs and papers with their usual meticulousness. Each movement was an exercise in civility, yet Purbright observed the lingering effects, a slight hesitancy in Mrs. Tyndall's step, Miss Teetle's eyes darting briefly to the jar one final time, the vicar's wife's hands clasped with unusual firmness. As they departed, Purbright picked up batch B and examined the amber preserve, noting the faint irregularities in its surface. Nothing unusual, nothing malicious, but as always, Flaxborough's drama was contained not in the object, but in the reception it elicited. Miss Teetle lingered. "Inspector, do you think they understood?" Purbright allowed a faint smile. "Understanding is often delayed and often subtle. Some will act correctly, some will misread entirely. The moral lesson unfolds over time, and the consequences, quiet though they may be, will ripple through the town." She made a small note. "So, it is the observation that matters, not the jar." "Precisely. The jar is merely a conduit. The true revelation lies in those who watch and how they respond." After the hall emptied, Purbright and Love walked back toward the station. The drizzle had softened to a fine mist, and the streets were deserted save for the occasional distant figure, cautious in its steps. "Inspector," Love said, "all we have is a jar and some letters. How can this really reveal anything?" Purbright allowed a faint, dry smile. "It is not the jar that reveals, nor the letters themselves. It is the subtle interplay between observation, conscience, and social expectation. Flaxborough is a theatre, and everyone acts upon the cues, often without conscious thought." They paused beneath a lamp-post. Purbright glanced toward the window of Daintree House, where a figure, perhaps Cora, perhaps not, stood briefly in the fog, as if sensing the subtle currents flowing through the town. "Yes," Purbright murmured, almost to himself. "The stage is set, and each observer has a role whether they realize it or not. Batch B has spoken already, quietly, and the first response, when it comes, will tell us more than any taste or test ever could." He allowed a small pause, then added softly, "And in Flaxborough the smallest gesture may carry the largest revelation." The mist thickened, softening the edges of the cobbles, and the inspector's mind turned to the subtle possibilities of consequence, hesitation, misinterpretation, and revelation, all quietly unfolding.